Testing, testing. Good morning. We are in the process of working through Unit 2. Unit 2 includes chapters 5 through 8. I know many of you have had questions as to what you need to be working on. You should have been working on reading, your vocabulary, the quizzes on Pearson. That is going to be your go-to always. In addition to that, you should have been working on Market Watch practice. This week I am gathering everybody's emails to set them up on the official game, which will start after spring break, which isn't a week from yesterday. And so that means in 2 weeks you should be able to log into the official game, even though it's already in process. My other classes have not had any additional time, so everybody's joining at the same time. That kind of keeps everybody on the same page. And that going forward, let's go ahead and start Chapter 5. Chapter 5, we're going to start putting a micro to the side. We're going to use the information, but we're going to use it in a different way. We're not going to focus on the small details. We're going to start looking at the bigger picture, and that starts with our nation's production and our nation's income and understanding what the differences is between that. So this chapter outlines the flip side of macro activity, from micro to macro. It starts with the measuring of nations' macro activity through our gross domestic product. There is a difference between gross domestic product and gross national product, and I will distinguish that. In addition to that, we're going to look at the income approach and using the national income, what the difference between our domestic national income and our our gross national income, and what's the difference between the two. We're also going to look at nominal versus real GDP and how it applies to inflation. We're going to look at the fluctuations on the GDP. You're going to start noticing a pattern that stock market and GDP kind of mirror each other, even though the stock market is only 7% of our GDP. Then we're also going to look at the GDP as a measure of welfare. Now, welfare in this sense does not mean our welfare programs, it means our happiness. So if you distinguish between welfare as how you're feeling, then you should understand that that's how the nation's reaction to our GDP is. All right, we've already kind of talked about the circular flow. We know that money goes one way and products go the opposite direction, that we are part of that product and we are part of receiving the income. So you need to understand that as we work, we produce a product, and that product gets put out on the market. The market is then we are purchasing from what we've produced, right? In that sense, if we take the money and as we purchase something, go the opposite direction, that goes into the market. Market then pays the company for the product. The product then buys the resources, which we are a part of that input, and as that resource, we receive a wage. Same goes for money, income, then revenue is generated. So we're going to look at basically the bigger picture. We're not going to look at one company specifically. We're going to look at all the industries as a whole, in its long run economic growth and how those fluctuations follow a business pattern. We're going to understand the essential essence of macroeconomics, which is that it's the nation's income when it focuses on inflation, unemployment, and the growth of our country. So if we understand that inflation is just the fluff, I like to say the stuffing of money, and it's not the actual value of money. So if you look at a dollar bill, what's written on that piece of paper is not necessarily what it's worth or what it can buy. So purchasing power is a big difference in how inflation affects it. You look at the exchange from the United States money to, let's say, the euro, it's going to be different in what you get back for it. You probably match the euro basically a little bit off. I think the euro is less than the dollar. But you see a major difference when you go like across the southern border. When you go into Mexico, the exchange rate for a dollar bill, you get more pesos for your dollar than if you were to take pesos to the United States and exchange it for dollar bills. So that difference is because of the value. It's not there. If we print out money, that value decreases, as opposed if we collect the money and take it out of circulation, that then increases the value. So that inflation is just a fluff between the two. All right, so how does this circular flow of production income affect every day? People go to work, they produce, they sell merchandise and provide services, and you get the income. So we already talked about that. It's important to understand it, and you can do it by drawing a picture. If you put yourself on one side and the firms parallel to you, you can draw a circle between the two. Put the resources or resource market on, say, the southern side of the circle. Then you can put the product on the northern side, and you can watch the money flow from one and draw it all the way around a circle, but then you can watch the product go the opposite direction. If you can visualize that, you can see how it applies, and we're going to add government into that too. And it's important to understand that businesses, government, and consumers all play a part of the circular flow. It helps to understand the domestic product when we look at that, but we also have an international side to this. So it's what we export and what we import, and so we kind of have to add that to that circular flow. And where does that go on the circle? It doesn't really go in the circle. It goes kind of to the side because we don't really need it, and it kind of is like an inner circle around the firm. So if you look at it this way, I'm going to pull up Jamboard on my screen so that you can kind of see that. It might make more sense. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I like Jamboard. It's a very picturesque way of doing things. All right, so if I were to take and put firms on one side and households on another, we've got product up here. And we've got resource. You also know that the resource is also inputs. I don't want to change my color just because it makes it easier to understand that as we spend money on a product, firms receive it in revenue, they pay for resources, and resources eventually go back to us, whether they are rent, wages, what else? Interest. And so forth. All right. We then get the opposite. We do work as an input to produce for the firm a product that we then buy. All right. And then we have in the middle government. Now, does government make a product? No. But they receive taxes. They receive taxes from the House, and they receive taxes from the firm, and corporate taxes. What do they produce? They give subsidies to firms, and they give benefits like infrastructure and services, things that to both of them actually. They produce something. They do produce. Through our work, they produce services. In the House side, as far as money goes, they don't do. They might give subsidies to farmers. They might give food stamps. Now, some of that stuff is not counted. We call that stuff transfer payments. And transfer payments don't count anywhere. Oops, I'm just going to erase all that. It's easier for me just to type it. And that's not counted towards our GDP because no income is done. No income to receive that payment. So if they're a poor person and you receive food stamps, House Section 8, or utility benefits, welfare checks, that's not income, but we do spend it and it does affect our economy. It's just not counted towards in the government side. Eventually it is written off. It's part of the payment side, but not through the government. It's through the households. So that transfers over to the house as money. You just don't count it towards intergovernment. So now where does the foreign entity play? So we'll say if you look at it, foreign countries, foreign entities, they export to firms and they import. So if we think about it, how does that money flow? Well, if we're exporting it, the company pays and the foreign entity pays taxes and they receive a cut. But as far as us getting it, we get products which we pay for. Now, those taxes, what do they get? Well, they get the benefit of having some kind of defense, NATO. They get a partnership. They get trade packs. They get a discount. So it's kind of hard to explain that foreign entity. Usually it's one way. But when we import, we reverse those. So when we import, we are then paying from the firm, and they are shipping us. It's kind of weird. And we also have that same, it's kind of like a two-way street. government. We get to put our bases on their country's soil. Those kinds of things. So this foreign entity is kind of hard to explain. It fits in the circular flow, but it doesn't fit well. So we like to just use it and explain it as net exports, which is exports minus imports. And that's the best way to explain it. Okay. Now, how do we write this formula out for GDP? All right, so you need to memorize this formula and how our GDP works. GDP, like an algebraic function, is a function of our yield. So you've seen f of x. Well, GDP is GDP of y. How the prices, our income, are entered in. And that comes up with just a basic addition problem. We've got consumers, our consumption, and we've got business or investment. Now, keep in mind I'm fixing to put a letter up here that I don't want you to confuse with the stock market. When I say investment, I'm saying private investment. So it's private investment into the country. So they're providing a service. They're providing a product. They're providing wages. So we say, and they also buy things. So they buy office supplies. They buy buildings. They buy people, resources. All right, so they have to do something. So they do spend. I like to say a business. Instead of I, it's easier to see the difference. So C is consumers, us. I is the firms. And then we've got governments. Government buys everything too. They even buy resources. So they kind of go like this. Government pays for and gets a resource. They spend, kind of goes the same way. It's a double edge. All right, let's back to our. Then we also have to add net exports. Now, net exports is down here in X. Net exports. So net exports goes up here in our little formula up here. We don't have to have it. If we were a closed country like China was in the 1600s, they didn't have international trade. They didn't need anything. They just needed their consumers, their businesses, and their government. And that's it. You didn't need anybody. All right, so C equals consumers or consumption. Consumption is basically 70% of our economy. We are the ones that spend the money. We work. We buy things. We provide income tax. We are 70% of our economy. If without us, the economy could crash. Then I, business, And then do it that way, because if you get that I is more than stock, it's not stock. Because stock is more like a loan. It's, you buy into a company to invest in, but it's not permanent. It's just a piece of paper, some kind of ownership into that firm. So then you're technically one of the people they have to pay out. So it's complicated. But if we look at I as just a business entity and think of it that way, then investment is, they invest into buildings, they invest into our economy, they invest into us, they pay us, they pay for those things. Where is their money going? It's not just they have to spend money. That has to be tracked somehow. So we need a firm. We need the firm to be understood as investment. Okay? All right. Then we have the third entity is G, which equals government. Now, government, they provide for our defense, they provide for education, they provide some health care. If you look at Social Security, they provide some Social Security, and they have some negotiation with the insurance companies. So they do play a part. And in return, they get workers. They buy uniforms, they buy buildings, they buy planes, trains, automobiles, paper. So they do spend, they buy food, they buy medicine. So they have a working relationship with our product. They spend money on product and they get a product. So they kind of involved. And then, of course, like I said, net exports, they're that foreign entity. We don't have to have them, but here's the thing is that we also have, firms also come to our country and pay our houses. I know that's really kind of for work, so they kind of like three-way here. But we don't count them through our income, because they also ship in workers themselves. So if you have foreign workers that come work for the company, we can't count them. They do spend money on groceries and rent and stuff like that, but some of that gets subtracted out. So they're a little bit of a complicated situation. Does anybody kind of understand the circular flow? And if you don't, please do me a favor, email me and I'll try to give it a different direction, or give you at least a video to watch so that maybe that'll help. I will look for, and you most likely want to keep an eye out for a circular flow video, because it is important to understand how all this works going forward. Because if you don't understand where the money goes and the products go, then you're not going to be able to do the math. I'm going to give you a chart. You're not going to be able to understand with the depreciation where it comes off of and what gets counted, what doesn't get counted. So it's important to understand this too. All right, let's go back to our PowerPoint. All right, so here's a little simple what I just drew. You can kind of take a picture of that and understand that there's a revenue goes one way, purchases go the other, incomes paid for factors, incomes paid for factors on the factor market. Goods are bought and sold, demand for factors, supply for factors. They all play a part. Government's not on this picture, but it kind of goes in the center. And for net is not on this picture. It goes on the outside. All funds that firms receive are eventually paid to households as payment, some factor of the production, whether it's land, labor, or capital. Land would be rent, labor would be wages, capital would be investment. And that's where that stock plays a part, okay? Capital, stock market. And then again, all that goes back out to the same, it comes out in goods and services. All right. So what's going to add value? Think about value. There's some things that we don't count, but yet on our income tax, when we file an income tax, we write that off. But does that mean we lose that as our overall gross income? Not really. If we think about things like brands, why is a brand more expensive than an off brand? It has a lot to do with the demand for it and how much we have in supply. So this kind of gives that value. We think it's special, it's more expensive, should be better in quality, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. So much of the output, let's say if we look at Walmart, it's not truly, how much is it due to Walmart itself? Well, in 2017, their annual report showed that they had roughly $361 billion, implying that the added value of $120 billion, which is 0.6% of our GDP, was its importance to the economy. Well, okay, so Walmart employs people. They also buy a lot of products. If their idea is made in America, they buy American. It's changed because of the net exports and how much in relationship it to our national as opposed to its global importance. So some of it, technically their sales in 2017 were 481, the difference of basically 120 billion. It's not all domestic. Some of it's national because they're a United States company, but they are internationally known. All right, so how does that make sense? If we approach it then as a nation's in its gross domestic product, we can technically measure our country's economy based on how much we actually produce inside our borders. And so that's how we break down that CIG index. We look at the total market value, the final goods and service, all in a given year itself. Once we do it, then we can compare from year to year, from decade to decade. We know that since the 1920s, we have grown as a country outside of inflation. We have actually bought and sold more than those who were raised in the 1930s. We like our things, so we've grown as a country as a result of the things that we have. And we do it off of total market value. If you looked at basically goods and services and multiply them by their prices, well, that's great. We have a value, we have an actual number, but does it actually show us how much we've bought and grown? Not necessarily, but we can at least get a dollar amount. We say, for an example, 2 cars at $25,000. That means that we've got $50,000 in worth. 3 computers at $2,000 per computer gives us $6,000. And if we add both industries together, we have $56,000. If that was our total economy, we'd have $56,000 in income. Now, the value, does that show if we were to do that from year to year? If we had $56,000 from year to year, did we grow? Well, it depends on how many number of things, like how many cars we sold, how many computers we sold. If we didn't sell the same number, then technically we didn't really grow as a country. We need to single scale that, summarize that total production. When you use and allow the scale and convert everything to dollars, makes it easier for us to put an amount on it, measuring them how much we're willing to pay on price. So we have a dollar amount. Well, that's great. But we also need to understand final goods and services. Now, if we were to look at your room, look around you, you can know that inside that building there are desks. I'm going to ask one question, and it's going to have multiple answers, because technically it's multiple answers. Is that desk a final good or service? If you said, well, it depends, you're absolutely right. It does depend. As far as an education, no, that's not a final good or service. It is an intermediate part. It is a part to the whole, because each whole, the teacher, the building, the desk, the books, paper, the pencils, each one of those is an intermediate good to the whole of the education. But if you looked at the desk in itself, by itself, it is a final good for desks. And to break that down, we would have the nuts, the bolts, the steel, the wood, the plastic. That would all be intermediate good for the desk itself. Another question, is a book a final product for education? Hopefully you said no. So knowing the difference between the two and being able to break them down. If we look at a car, the intermediate parts would be the parts that actually make the car. The door, the nuts, the bolts, the steel, the leather, the plastic, all that would be intermediate. The car itself would be the final product. However, if we look at just repair services, the nuts, the bolts, all those intermediate parts in themselves, sold by themselves, are final goods and services. It gets complicated, and I understand I just completely confused you, but each individual thing can be a final good, but it also can be a resource. So it depends on what the goal is. If the goal is education, then the desk is not a final good. It is a part to that service. If the total goal to the car, then the nuts and bolts are an intermediate good to the whole of a car. Next, we also, when we say in a given year, the question becomes, when do we buy it? If you bought a 2022 car in 2021 in December, is it a 2022 economy, or is it a 2021 economy? That is the question. If you said it's a 2021, you're absolutely right, because it was bought in 2021. However, how many of you buy brand new cars? Most likely, nobody in this room bought a brand new car. So, then the next question is, are used cars considered, if they're purchased in today's time, this year's economy? No, used cars are not part of today's economy, because the original purchaser bought it and then sold it. The first purchase is the only purchase we actually care about. Every purchase after that, we don't really care about it when it comes to GDP. It's what's newly produced in a given year. If it's not produced this year and sold this year, we don't count it. We count it in the year that it was produced and sold. So that keeps us from double counting. Like a used car is double counted if we were to count it. We value it because it's cheaper for us not to have bought a brand new car. And technically we did spend money, but the money is not counted until its final use. It is an income to the person who sold it, but it is not for goods and services. It's kind of like that transfer payment for government stuff. It's not counted. So we want to make sure that we're not using it for GDP, but when they go to buy groceries or something, that's when it's counted. So the used car it's just a benefit. But it allows us to see, if we look at everything new in a given year, purchases in that year, how much we actually produced, and we eliminate some of the extras from our GDP. It kind of just makes it easier. All right. Now, most of you should remember the real versus nominal. We know that real is all with all the fluff taken out, all that inflation taken out. And the nominal principle means it's basically what we think it should be valued at. So it's what it is during that given time frame, not what it is comparably from year to year. So what matters to people is the real value itself. When we talk about income, when it's purchasing power, it's not necessarily the dollar bill, what's written on it. It's how much can I buy for that dollar bill? How many items can I get for it? So we want to make sure that GDP is also done the same way. So we take off the inflation and we look at the numbers and put a set dollar amount per number. And this helps us determine the difference between real and nominal. If in today's prices, I look at everything I bought, and then I looked at 1929's prices and everything that I bought, if they happen to be the same number, why is the difference in the dollar amount? Well, because the prices themselves are different, and so that inflation has to be adjusted off of it. And if we set everything to the same price, the things that we bought, if we bought 50 items in 1920 and 50 items today, those items need to be set at the same price. So if we want to say use today's prices in 1929, they were the same number, then we didn't grow. And so this is exactly what we're trying to talk about. Let's look at 1947 to 2017. We can actually compare those because part of the nominal is due to changes in prices, and we concentrate the real to measure the economic growth. It's sustained increases in a real GDP over a longer period of time. We don't want to look at today and yesterday. That's not very much change, because if we're looking at gas prices today, there's a big difference. But if we looked at gas prices from, say, 2008 and today, and if you notice that there's not much change, then was there inflation in gas? No. But because our economy changed the gas prices, and demand changed the gas prices, and supply changed the gas prices, technically we can see that there was some change over the years. But if we pick specific years and there's no change, then there's no change. Then there's no inflation. If we look at 1950 and say 2010, 1950's GDP was less than 4 trillion, and in 2010 it was more than 16 trillion. Well, guess what? There's a big difference. That's 12 trillion difference. But with the items that we bought in our baskets of goods and services, it's the same number. That's the question. So let's look at consumption expenditures, and let's just say in 2017, GDP was in billions of dollars, $19,500 billion, or basically $19,500 billion. Consumption was 13 trillion of that. Private investment, or I, was 3 trillion of that. Government expenditures was 3. But notice that we have a negative number in our exports. So the next question is, okay, so how does that affect our GDP? If we add 13, 3, and 3, that would be technically 16, give or take all the change. So basically it's 13, 16, 5, 16, 6, 19, 6, $20,000 between consumption, private investment, and government. But we have a negative network, so we have to take that off of our GDP. So if we have a negative, what does that mean? Did we have more exports or more imports? If you notice that net exports was exports minus imports, you should have gotten that we had a negative, we had more imports going out. And that would give us, technically, a negative number. We'd have to take that off now. All right. Now, here's another. Okay, so if we're looking at newly produced goods and services, there's bunches of purchases consumers are currently buying. Whether they're foreign or domestic, it's basically about 70%. But if we break it down even further, we know that it's broken down into durable goods. Now, here's the thing. How would you classify a house? Is that a durable good or a non-durable good? Okay, so hopefully you understood that a durable good is things that are going to last a lot longer than a year. Something that's lasting 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So a house should be considered a durable good. Flour. Is flour a durable good or a non-durable good? It depends. It depends on whether you make a product with it. Wheat in itself, if it gets wet, will spoil. Flour, if it gets wet, will spoil. But if it stays dry and it's never used, unless the bugs get it, it's not going to change, right? So could it have a shelf life of more than a year? It depends. Services, do they last more than a year? Are they used up? So internet, is it gone today? Or does it on a daily basis? So those are 3 different categories. We have durable goods, things that last more than a year. Non-durable goods, things that usually last less than a year. And services that are every single day. This not only is a consumption expenditure, it could also be a business expenditure or investment. It could be a government expenditure. So keep in mind these durable, non-durable, and services. They don't just apply to consumption. All right, private investments. Now here's the thing. Private investments, they take that non-durable, durable, and service to a different level. They buy plants and equipment that last longer than a year. They buy housing that lasts longer than a year, but can people leave every 6 months? It's possible. So think about it. That takes that non-durable to good. It's rent is what they're talking about. And then changes in inventory. Well, if you merge, do you get to count that? And if we look at Macy's buying Foley's, if anybody remembers Foley's, Macy's bought its inventory, Foley's bought its inventory, but when you merge a company, do you get to count Foley's inventory? No. You only get to count Macy's. So that kind of changes a little bit. It's not a service, but workers could be a service. Things that they provide could be a service. So we have to be careful on how we determine how we break things down. We also have to be careful what we consider investment. Remember that investment is the capital. It's the financial term behind private investment. So I like to say business in this situation. Just make sure I'm going to stress this over and over and over again so that you kind of understand that I is not investment in financial, it's business. All right, notice that I did not talk about government from here on out because I need to switch gears and explain business a little bit more. So a gross investment. If I buy a building, it's going to last from year to year, right? But it doesn't mean that the upkeep's not there. So how do I keep track of everything? So if we understand that sometimes things lose value, most of you've bought a car. If you've ever buy a brand new car, as soon as you drive it off the lot and put a mile on it, it depreciates its actual value. You can't resell it for the same amount as you bought it. So that's kind of why that used car situation happens. Technology is also the same situation. So how do we, if we're like having to borrow money to buy things, how do we put value on those things that don't expire, like houses or like buildings or infrastructure? Well, we take the overall gross investment, that's that total purchase amount, and we take off technically what happens to the wear and tear, the amount that we actually have to buy parts or services to fix it. We have to take that off because that's new stuff. So that's been calculated different. And we then call this capital consumption allowance. It's the same thing. It's things that make it obsolete, to make it no longer, well, compatible with modern technology, modern wants and desires. So that's called depreciation. And we can take that off if we need to borrow against it. And this makes our net investment. So that's the gross investment minus its depreciation, and what's left over is considered a net investment. So if by chance we took the largest part of investment in Q3 or third quarter in 2017, we had a $2,512,000,000,000 in depreciation compared to a $737 billion in net. So if we take off, we can figure out what the depreciation amount. That's quite a bit of depreciation right there. In fact, that's about 1.8 billion in depreciation. It's possible because technology expires the value of what the economy, if it's good or bad. If our economy cycle is in a negative turn, then the value is going to go down. If what happens, if let's say a criminal element moves into town, the value then depreciates. Nobody wants to be there. The demand itself is not there. So think depreciation, demand for it, they're almost one and the same. All right, now we can focus on government. Now, government's going to go through just like consumption and just like private investment. Government also has purchases, and those are also for those newly produced goods. But we also look at government as local, state, and federal. All that is government, and each entity has its own budget, its own purchasing power, its own abilities to provide. Could be, local provides for the city, municipal water. State's not going to be involved in that. State then provides defense, possibly. Or maybe the water's infrastructure throughout, from like, say, lakes and oceans and all that. That's a possibility. The federal government wouldn't have anything to do with that. In fact, Texas, look at Texas Power. It's not on the national grid. So everything needs to operate separately, and they all have a budget, and they all have expenditures. So if we look at each level, Then we look at wages and benefits for government workers. They're not all paid the same way, but we purchase for labor. Now, we don't include transfer payments. So if you're working and you notice on your FICA that there's Medicare and Social Security, that goes into a nice big old pool that the government collects. Well, guess what? That's not the government's money, so they can't count it because that's going to then go back to the people in a certain period of time. You technically are paying for your own welfare, for like if you need food stamps and if you need utilities paid when you're, say, in between jobs or lose a job or unemployed. That FICA goes towards that big old pool. The government doesn't get to actually use that money because that's your money. So they borrow it occasionally. If we borrow from the World Bank, borrowing money, like a loan, the interest we actually pay on that, we don't get to count as part of our income. We have to take kind of like a depreciation. We have to take that off. So these are all part of that transfer payments. We can't actually count as our income. It's there, but it's like that depreciation. We take the gross and then we take that transfer payments off, and we actually are dealing with a net. Even though we call it gross domestic product, we're dealing with a net because we take the transfer payments off. They're just basically payments from the government to individuals that don't actually involve an actual income, or they don't correspond with production of some sort. We're not paying wages. That's just something that's given to people. Interest, we're not paying wages on that. It's just part of that process of borrowing, the benefit of having it. So that's part of that. So we're actually dealing with a net on GDP. And we've talked about net exports, imports overseas, hence they basically are not connected to our domestic production. So they're not counted technically in our consumption expenditure. We then subtract them, so we're sort of over counting them. Amazon has foreign made products. Amazon has paid for those. We get the benefit of buying them, but it's part of that net export. It's that complicated foreign entity situation. We don't actually count it. It's already been counted once, so it's not part of the consumption portion of it, even though it's complicated. So something, just like we said before, that ceteris paribus, some things we have to hold fixed. We don't count it. This is part of that. All right. So if we're looking at net exports and stuff like that, we've heard people refer to as having a surplus, a trade surplus or a trade deficit is really what we're actually. It means that technically what's coming in on a deficit is more than what's actually going out. On a surplus, what's coming in is less than what's going out. We really would like to focus and have, for our economy, a trade surplus. It means that we're actually making more money. But those net exports have to be positive, and for that to happen, when it's negative, we then have a trade deficit. It means that we're spending additional money to other countries. When we have a trade balance, that's perfect because we're exporting just as much as we're bringing in. When we start talking about debt, this all kind of replays itself, but it's different. Make sure that you don't confuse a trade surplus and trade deficit with debt. It's not the same thing. Alright, so now we've come to our formula that I wrote out earlier. GDP is basically just an equation that equals Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Memorize it. It will be on the test. You will have to actually compute this. You'll have to understand when I start messing with government and taxes, how that plays out. it gets complicated. But this is the most basic form of that formula. Memorize it, take a picture of this, do whatever you've got to do to get it in your notes. Replay, pause, whatever. Make sure this is in your notes. It will be on the test. All right. Now, so just like we talked about Walmart and the brand value, how do we value somebody's intelligence? How do we put a dollar amount on that? How do we, if I come up with a project, it's my brain that went into thinking the interaction and I can explain it, and I have a patent on it. How do I put a dollar on it if I'm just doing the research behind it? So intellectual properties, which is basically the research and development, do works of art, do products, mechanics, they're crucial. If we don't have up-and-coming ideas, we're going to basically fall behind economically. If we think traditionally as intermediate goods, then we can kind of look at the bigger picture and figure out where they fall in and how they're actually counted indirectly. Their contribution to expand our economy. We actually have companies that's all they do is research and development. They don't provide products or anything. So that's all they focus in on. And if we look at it, in 2013, we actually consider them an investment instead. It's something that we should pay to expand, pay to have people do. This is when it all came about. We switched from being a manufacturing to a research and development, service-oriented type company per se. We didn't produce as much. And we put value on ideas, app development, product development, and marketing styles. So these things, this is some of what the GDP does take into account why we went durable, non-durable, and then services. Why we didn't just think goods only. We started paying people for their intermediate good on their brains. All right, so that's GDP in its nutshell. But how does GDP move to income? The circular flow, it makes it clear on how a person's production becomes income. If we think that way, then we can actually figure out how a nation activity can actually measure production. And if we look at everything that we pay, all that revenue the companies made, all the wages people made, everything the government spent, goods and services, we added all that money up. Then we come up with a national income. That total income is basically earned by everybody, whether we're here domestically or abroad. Because if we think about it, military, they don't not all live here. They work overseas. They make money. But how do we count their money as our money? Well, they're on foreign soil, but they're on U.S. Paid for soil. So since they're on that soil, we can count them. They are U.S. citizens. They make money for U.S. But then we deduct the rent that we pay. If we buy Harley Davidson here in the United States, can we count Harley Davidsons in Germany, where their plant is? Yes, we can, because it's an American company. Now, the people that work inside it might not be American, so we have to take their wages off. So it's kind of like a give take. If it's not inside our borders, we can still count it we have to do kind of like that net exports, do some deductions. All right, so if we think that way, then if we look at as GDP takes off the net exports, we can then take off and do gross domestic product as a gross. And the national income, they should be relatively close because we have foreign entities working here. If we have just as much working overseas, that kind of balances out. But there's a spell. The national income, we just have to take off something so to get that national income itself. So product wise, we can figure that they should be basically the same. But the income is the money side of it. We add net income earned by our firms and our residents, and that gives us the national product. We deal with just the national product itself. Then, as long as it's within our borders, we call it GDP. And the national product is basically our nation's citizens. We then take off the depreciation, and so anything that's replacing like existing plants and equipment, just like we would before, we take that off because it's no longer worth in value. Take that off, and that's our net national income. So sometimes value and gross are not necessarily the same. And so gross national product is basically GDP plus our net income earned abroad. Just know the difference between national and domestic. If you can remember borders, you're going to get the answer right. It's just going to be a multiple choice question. It's not going to be expansion on that. Notice that if you're able to explain how people who are from foreign countries here have to be taken off, you'll get it right. But value added, that's basically sums of all the income, wages, interest, profits, rent generated by an organization. For a firm, we can add measure value added by the dollar value minus the dollar value of the goods and services from other firms. So if we look at automobile versus steel, add everything together, we get our total economy, less the purchases from other firms. So if those firms don't purchase anything, we then take that off. This equals the value, the sum of all wages, interest, everything that they haven't, what's left over after purchases. That's the income. So if we were to do a budget, you say, this is how much money came in, and this is how much we need to buy. And we take off, then we have what's called profit, the difference between profit. So basically value added is our profit. It's what did it give back? What do we have left over that we can spend? Simply national income as far as the automobile, steel, and the chart we have here. The 16,000 consisted of 10,000 in value added by the firm and 6,000 in value added by the steel, because that 6,000 in purchases by the automobile industry comes off, and what's net for the firm is its added value to the steel's added value, which they didn't spend anything, and our total economy then has everything that we actually spent money on and had left over in income. All right, so we're back to my circular flow and the foreign, and as you can see, the new linkages of our net exports. It deals with product. Mine was a little more complicated, showing you where the money went, how it would go in regards to the government and in regards to the firms. So the money flow is a little bit different than the import-exports, but all we care about is the rest of the world and how it met. We can take it off and close our borders, and then we'd have our regular basic central flow. Notice that taxes are here, but the purchase of factors from the factory market for the government, allows us to provide supplies and goods and services to the product market. So we provide education, military. After we've bought teachers and buildings out of the government make money, well, it makes money through taxes. That's how the flow happens. Take a picture of this so that you can actually explain it. Alright, here's the link between self-reported happiness. Now we're back to that welfare thing. So does a higher GDP make us actually happier? If we look over the last 30 years, they're not as happy, but yet our GDP, people are working more, the wages haven't gone up, they're buying more. So, but at a given point in time, people with higher incomes report higher levels of personal satisfaction. They're able to enjoy life, leisure time. So, is money making us happier, or are things making us happier? Or do we make our own happiness? That has nothing to do with money or things. That's a philosophical question. That is something that philosophy is. What do you think? You're the only one that can determine how happy you are. I can't make you happy. Money can't make you happy. Things can't really make you happy. So what makes people happy? Is it really linked to GDP? If we look back at the 1920s, are we as happier? Are we healthier? Does healthiness make us happier? The ability to entertain ourselves, does that make us more happy? Go places. Since we're able to fly now, and we can go anywhere in the world, does that make us happier? Traveling. What makes us happy? Is it economical? You have to answer that question. According to this, maybe money can buy happiness. It can buy us things. It can buy us time. If you're making $100,000, but you're only spending $30,000, you can take vacation time. And sometimes that downtime does make us happier. It's a possibility. Sometimes we need to take a better look at real versus nominal. We've discussed different ways of measuring ourselves, our happiness, the production. We've looked at people who buy goods and services. We looked at income that's created through all of that. Of all these, we technically need to understand that for our economic growth, if we use GDP, what's inside our borders most often, this is why we say we don't really need international. If we use this, it technically explains our economy. What we do inside our borders has more effect, consumer-wise, than net. Alright, so, like I said, all of measures we've discussed, GDP is one of the most commonly. It's just easier sometimes because we've got that formula. Just add everything together and take off, and that we're good. Alright. So, how do we determine growth? Like I said before, is it price or is it things? If we're looking from year to year, and we notice that, we'll take this chart. It's easier to just go ahead and show you the chart. So if we're looking at 2011, we only took cars and computers. And the quantity produced, cars was 4, computers was 1, And the price itself was $10,000. So the computers were $5,000. And we looked at 2012, and we have 5 cars produced and 3 computers. But the price is different. Cars went up to $12,000. Computers stayed the same at $5,000. Which one did we grow? Well, if we multiply everything out, 4 times 10,000, that's 40,000 on 2011 on cars times the price. And then computers, 1 times 5,000, that's 5,000. We add those across, so 40,000 plus 5, that's 45,000. And if we did the same thing for 2012, 5 times 12 is 60,000, and 3 times 5 is 15,000. So 60 plus 15 is 75,000. Well, technically, dollar-wise, we did grow. We can specifically look at this, the quantity, and we could tell we actually produced. If we fixed everything price-wise, if we looked at the quantity itself, we can actually see that the economy grew. We grew in 1 car and 2 additional computers. If we're looking at price, the prices went up only on cars. Did it go substantially enough to cause that major? Yeah, it did, but it's not. If we were just looking at 4 and 1, we still look at, if we used the prices for 2011 and changed it, instead of using 2011's, use 2012's. Well, 5 times 12 is, we got 75,000, but if 4 times 12, that's 48,000 plus 1 computer, that's only 53. We still grew if we use price-wise. But we can absolutely tell how much we grew based on how many additional products we were able to make. Okay, so sometimes that price has to stay fixed, and we look at the quantity instead. And that shows us the economy is growing. But as far as nominal, we know nominally, because the prices are different for each year, that we grew as well. Nominally, we grew by $30,000. And that is basically taking that $75,000 and subtracting that $45,000. That gives us $30,000 difference between 2011 and 2012. If we look at the real, and we fixed it to, say, 2011's prices, we didn't grow as much. Because if we just use 2011's prices, just like I did in 2012's prices, 4 cars times 10, and 1 car times 5, that still gives us $45,000, because 2011 is not going to change. That's our base year. But if we use it and apply it to 2012, we had 5 cars times 10,000, that's 50,000, plus the 3 computers, 3 times 5,000, that's where the iffy issue is going to be. And that's 15,000, and, well, that's $65,000. That's only at $20,000. There's a $10,000 difference in price. What $10,000 difference in price is inflation. So real GDP, 45 in 2011 and 65 in 2012. So real grew by 20,000. In a percentage terms, this is a 20,000 increase from its initial $45,000. We can see this percentage growth if we take that increase. That's 65 minus 45, 20,000 change in GDP, and divide it by our base year, our 2011's GDP. We get a 0.44 or a 44.4% increase. So how does can we see this in actual working? If we go back to our Jamboard, you need to understand this. if we're looking at a change in GDP divided by our base year GDP. Oops, sorry. All right, so a change in GDP equals our current that we're looking at, we'll say 2020, or in our case 2021, because it's income tax season, GDP. And we wanted to compare a base year, our base year, GDP. And so if I'm looking at 2011, that base year would be 2011, right? So let's go up here. So that's 21 minus 11 GDP divided by 11's GDP. Does that help you understand it? A change in GDP gives us what we're looking for, which is the percentage growth in GDP. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. You take your current GDP minus your base year GDP. Doesn't matter what year it is. Today, 2011 to 2020, or 2011 to, say, 1920s. Make sure that you're dividing by 1920s. Whatever the oldest year is. So your current divided by your oldest year. All right, and that would be our real percentage growth. So this basically plots out it's a graph that plots out the real versus the nominal GDP in billions of dollars from, say, 2012, all the way back to 1940s. So we can plot that real GDP and notice that they're pretty much parallel until they hit about 2008. And what happened in 2008? We didn't grow. We had a depression. We had a recession. So some of those depression and declines in GDP, they're going to stop the difference between a real and a nominal. They're going to basically freeze everything because prices are going to drop. Growth is going to stop happening. Consumption is going to stop happening. People are going to stop buying. Businesses are going to stop buying. Unemployment is going to increase. Inflation is going to change. It's going to completely change the way we look at GDP. So, but if you notice that the real GDP up until 2000 was higher than our nominal. So what does that tell you about prices? Hopefully you will say that prices are less than their actual worth. So that real means that we actually had a lot of growth. Now, we haven't had a lot of growth since 2009. It looks like we have, but wages didn't grow. Our consumption went up. Prices go up too. We need to look at inflation then. Maybe we need to figure this graph out a little bit more in detail. All right, so how do we determine whether it deflated or inflated? We can use this difference between real versus nominal to tell us how those prices actually change. We call it the GDP deflator. It is basically taking the nominal, our base year, the one that we're worried about, the one that's inflated, and dividing it by real. So we go back and we look at, okay, well, I got a difference in prices. Well, everything has to get fixed. So it's an index basically that measures how prices of goods and services change. Are they going up? Are they going down? Or are they staying the same? And then it's just a percentage. But instead of having a change, we just want to deal with the nominal. So I just want to take 2011's prices and divide it by that real GDP. Take off the fluff. Set everything to the same price. Take up current prices, figure it out, and then set everything to those base prices. And so our nominal GDP in 2012 was 75,000. Our real GDP was 65,000. Divide that and multiply, and it's a 15% difference than our base year. Now I'm going to tell you this is something that makes it easier to understand. If you can figure out GDP deflator, you already understand inflation. Because what we're doing now is inflation just deals with what we call a CPI. It's taking those prices and fixing them to the price, same price. Everything that was in 2011 to everything in our base year. Everything in 2012 to everything in our base year. Now, if 2011 is our base year, then it should be 100%, right? Nothing's changed. No inflation. But if it's 115, the difference between 100 and 115, they change in prices 15%. You already know that inflation happened at a 15% rate. That the GDP deflated by 15%. Because we take off, in order to understand the difference between nominal and real, we got to take off that inflation. All right, so the GDP is just one index of how the price index is a gauge of prices over time. In 1996, the U.S. Commerce Department used this method to calculate real GDP and measure changes in prices. Now it uses what's called a chain-weighted index, which is a little bit more complicated, but it's more accurate in measure from yearly. A chain weight its method for calculating changes in prices. It uses an average of base years. So if I want to say 1929 to 1939 to 1949, used decade-wise, I could sit here and over a period of time, I can actually see that, like, from the last 10 years, the prices in gas did not actually go up from 2008 to 2022. Because they went up and they went down. They went up and they went down. They went up and they went down. But they're pretty much the same. That's that chain. It's that average. It's like, okay, the ups and the downs, and I've averaged them out. And they should pretty much give me basically an average line. If I had an average line, there's no difference in gas prices. I just like to use gas prices to say, oh my God, today's inflation is higher than it was yesterday. Kind of gives you an idea that we've got some issues. We've got to make decisions fast. And if we look over our fluctuations of GDP, we know that over long periods, we can see a gradual incline. It's not, we have our ups and downs, but over a period of time, we can draw a straight line between those ups and downs, and we can find an average in our business cycle, whether are they consistently up and down, like a roller coaster up and down, or are they just spikes that are gradually moving upward. So real GDP does not always necessarily grow smoothly. Sometimes it collapses suddenly, and sometimes we have an economic boom. Those booms and busts, we can sit here and look at them as waves. We have a peak, and our peak means that we're booming. We're doing great. But then we also have recessions and depressions, and that means that we technically are declining. Recession, we're busting. So anytime we have an expansion, we call it a boom. And anytime we have a recession, it's our trough situation. It's the lower end. Hopefully that trough is shortened, goes back up, or we have a depression instead of having a recession, and it continues to decline. This is going to be based on whether or not we have expansionary or contractionary fiscal or monetary policies. To determine how long, what consists a recession, is that it actually has a period of time that it's either that length of time or longer. 2007 actually started in 2006. We had the red flags right then and there. The decline itself, major decline, didn't start happening until like 2007, and we started making decisions in 2008. We didn't start seeing a reaction until about 2009, where we hit our lowest point. So that we had those red flags. The recession, though, the decline period is what we actually measure, and that only lasts, as long as it lasted 6 months or longer, we call a recession. So technically, the time it takes is not something we worry about. The actual decline from the economy, the actual across the board decline from all industries, is where we start measuring. When all industries start declining, then we know that we're in a recession if it lasts longer than 6 months. The period after the trough, when it starts to go up, we call that an expansionary period, and that's basically an economic recovery. It can last for decades. 2009 to 2022, that's a pretty long stretch for a recovery and a boom. But that's all. We've had nothing but expansion since that 2009. And so that can last for longer periods of time. We're not worried about expansion, but the recession, when it lasts more than a year, that's when we start calling a depression. Commonly we like to say recession. However, we are reevaluating that situation because the Great Depression lasted 10 years. The fiscal financial crisis in 2008, it lasted about from beginning red flag, start government action, a year. The trough, getting the feeling to come back up, was a year. That would be considering our inside and outside lags in government action. And did it take effect? If it didn't have an effect, then it starts to, the government inside and outside lag doesn't count anymore. But so let's look at that 2007 to 2009. If you look at it, we were growing. But we had our first red flag when that plateau happened in 2006. And then again, halfway between, and then we had another bump. And the housing still was, people were like, oh, we'll just expand monetarily and we'll offer more loans. That's great. And we thought between the end of like September, with that push, we would recover and not have a major, well, we backfired because some of those loans weren't necessarily good and jobs changed. So we started declining instead of plateauing in from September to October. And then we had an increase, but then it dropped off the planet right about the turn of January 2008. And then it just fell. Typically, if we looked from 2005 to 2009, there wasn't that much of a drastic change. But if we looked at just those 3 years, there was, because we had a business increase. So the peak is the date it starts a recession to tip over. So in this graph, where is our peak? I mean, is it in October of 2007? Or was it in September? Or was it in November? Or was it in January of 2008? Or was it then October? Somewhere halfway between. Can we put a line from one peak to the next and classify it as a anomaly dip? Maybe a red flag dip? It's possible. And then, of course, we had between 2009 the recovery phase, all the buyouts to the car companies, to the banks. TARP was to the banks. We also had the car company buyout, the stimulus checks that were part of the summer of 2009. They were part of the summer of 2009. They weren't enough. The date at which the output, though, stops falling is a concerted trough. You need to know the peak and trough. Can you pinpoint exactly? Does it have to be exact? No, it doesn't. We have had 11 recessions, not counting the 2020, since the 1940s, 1948 to 49, and this doesn't count the Great Depression, 1953 to 54, when we have the Korean War, 57, 58, 60, 61, 69 to 70, that would be OPEC. Actually, 73 and 75 is OPEC too. 69, 70 is the pullout of Vietnam War completely. 1980s, all of 1980 almost. 1981, 82. 1990, 1991, Desert Storm. 21, March to November. And December 27 to June 29. The last depression that we experienced that was longer than a year or two was the Great Depression, and it was 4 years. End of World War II is technically when we really felt the major incline. Going into that war was what helped give us a good boost. And then, of course, the buying spree after we call it, having what the Joneses have in the 1940s really skyrocketed us until we had those 11 recessions. All right. If we were to discuss, going back to that happiness question, that philosophy question, hopefully you've been thinking about it. As a nation, if we measure the output produced by an economy, we can measure the economic growth. We can define whether we're in a recession or depression. And then we can compare it to other countries. Other countries as a whole compared to us, we would say that the United States is happier. Everybody wants to come here. But it's not a perfect measure. The GDP is not really a perfect measure because then we've got unemployment that kind of goes up and down. We have inflation that goes up and down, or it doesn't exist, or it's only 2.5% and doesn't hurt us. We have, leisure time that's could be seasonal. And we're going to talk about more about that unemployment inflation in the next chapters. But we don't we look at the housewife or the houseman and consider their work any less productive? Do they need maybe some breaks from housework? Transactions outside markets that are not considered in our GDP are not counted. And this is, we want to put value in our welfare. We need to take into consideration those things that we do. You do chores at home. Are you overworked and underpaid? How about that childcare, that cost of having to pay for that? If we don't pay for it and we keep them at home, who's paying for that? Is it taking away from other work that could be done inside the house? Typically, if we were to examine housework, though, we look at women where they've entered the workforce. They gained measured labor dollars, but they lost that unmeasured. Who's now doing our houses dirtier? Are our kids not being taken care of, left alone more often? Does that make our children unhappy? Does that mean at the end of the day we really just are not happy because we come home to a dirty home? That's a question. It is an economic question too. Leisure. Households, they value our downtime, but GDP doesn't care about it. We like our vacations. Increases in work hours, going from a 10 to 14 hour job, labor, back in the 20s and 30s, to an 8-hour. Did it make us any happier? Or working more than one job inside that 8 hours? Or we working harder for those 8 hours? Was that one specific, just clock in, clock out type job? Less work, more production, happier? Or more work, less downtime, in a shorter period of time, making us happier? Our weekends off, making us happier? What about the added expense of having that I can get to work faster now because I have a car? There's a cost to it. It now has pollution. Is that making us happier or healthier? Or is it causing more health problems, higher costs? So is it more harm done now that we can get there faster and work less? These are the shortcomings of our GDP. They don't take those costs and those considerations into how much we are actually making, how much it's actually costing us. If we were to compare it to, let's say, other countries, because underground economy has a 41% underground black market. Central America, South America, 41% drug market, underground economy. Asia, 30%. Europe, United States, Japan is only 17%. So this underground economy, it's typically things that we're working, making money, but we don't necessarily report it on our taxes. So it may be illegal, or it could be that we're evading having to pay on money tips. It's a possibility of that deadbeat parent who works under the table, illegal immigrants who make money, who spend it in the economy. Not necessarily, they're making it under the table, not the ones that are actually working and paying taxes. But they're not paying the income taxes. We've got underground economy that could be drug money, could be guns. This activity could be technically much higher, we're not sure, in developing countries than a highly developed country, because we can kind of see our criminal activity and kind of decrease that under the ground table. So some of that in developing country may not be noticeable. So, it could be higher. Africa could be better off if they got rid of their crime and their government black market. This is chapter 5. It kind of gives you an insight into the national economy. Kind of gives you an insight on where we spend our money, who spends our money, how we spend our money. We're going to get into more specifics, but it should seem easier when we're talking about the bigger picture than it has. So hopefully this kind of was a little bit easier to understand. Look for chapter 6, 7, and 8 between now and the end of spring break. You will be responsible for these key terms. You should have already done your vocabulary. They are already part of that. Keep the vocabulary list that's on the discussion. But other than that, unless you have questions, that's chapter 5. Go get your quiz done if you haven't already done it. Get your homework done if you have not already done it. And update your notes so that you have what needs to be in your notes.